this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to the World War II podcast. For this episode, I'm joined by Prit Buttar to discuss Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive launched in the summer of 1944 that shattered the German Army Group Centre. While the D-Day landings dominate the narrative of mid-1944, events on the Eastern Front were just as decisive, if not more so, in determining the course of the war in Europe. Prit's latest book in his series looking at the Eastern Front during World War II is Bagration, 1944, The Great Soviet Offensive. Welcome back, Prit. I wonder if we should start by perhaps looking at where we left off. Start by looking at the overall strategic situation on the Eastern Front in mid-1944. Was the Soviet Union ready to launch a large offensive?
As you'll probably remember from the book, I start the narrative actually with the Tehran Conference, which lays the groundwork for the fighting of 1944. This is, if you like, the test of Hitler's Führer directive from the autumn of 1943, where we're going to hold the Red Army back with the minimum number of troops that we need for the job. And if absolutely necessary, we will trade space for time whilst we concentrate all of our resources in the West in anticipation of a Western invasion. And when the Western Allies come ashore, we'll smash them on the beaches and then we'll send everything east to defeat the Soviet Union. As strategic plans go, it's a pretty awful plan, really. But given the resources left for Germany and given the options, I guess it was about the only conceivable plan short of admitting it was all over and surrendering. It was about the only option left. So really, you can look at 1944 as a test of this theorem. Can Germany hold off the Red Army with one hand whilst defeating the Western Allies with the other and then concentrate on the Red Army, particularly when the bare minimum required to hold off the Soviet Union amounts to 70% of Germany's resources. Even when you're giving the West priority, you can only actually release 30% of your military resources. So the whole planning of the fighting in 1944 is predicated by the Allies upon an understanding that they're going to do this more or less at the same time. There is no detailed we're going to attack on this date and we'd like you to attack on that date. There is just an understanding of we're both going to do this in the summer. And in some respects, they're making a virtue out of a necessity, as the Soviets have done throughout the war, which is that if you can't coordinate things absolutely precisely, actually having them unfolding in close sequence is not a bad thing, because the Germans will rush off any reserves they have to the first threat, and then the second operation that unfolds has a greater chance of success. So by now, Stalin feels he's finally pushed Churchill and Roosevelt into a corner, and they're going to open the long-awaited invasion of Europe. The Western Allies have extracted from Stalin a promise that as soon as this operation in Western Europe begins, the Red Army will launch a major assault in the East in order to tie down the Germans. So if you like, that is the background. You can make a very, very strong case for saying that by this stage of the war, even before D-Day and before Bagration, Germany has really lost the war, but it still has enormous resources. And, these operations are not going to be easy. It is not beyond the bounds of possibility that one or other of the Allied offensives in East or West will come to grief. So the actual execution of these plans and the deception around them and how they're carried out plays a very, very important part in the story, as indeed does Hitler's own intransigence, both in East and West, which contributes enormously to the success of the Allies.
Well, he's insistent on these fortress towns as his defensive Is it a defensive line, or we've got a series of defensive points? This is because they're now on the defensive, which is an admission in itself.
Well, it is. He's struggling to come up with an operational or tactical level response to being on the defensive. Traditional German thinking in terms of defensive fighting has always been around the principle of we will hold a front line and we will inflict as heavy losses as possible on the enemy when they attack, in the full understanding that sooner or later, if they're half competent, they're going to break through the line and they're going to get into our rear areas where you have the panzer divisions waiting in order to defeat them. This has evolved on the Eastern Front to an understanding that actually even holding that rigid line of defense becomes very difficult. But despite our losses, despite being outnumbered, at a tactical level, we still enjoy a superiority over the Red Army. Our NCOs, our junior officers, etc., are much better at showing initiative, at dealing with a fast-changing situation than their Soviet counterparts. If you look at all of the successful operations on the Eastern Front after Stalingrad for the Germans, they are all when the battle becomes really quite fluid and the more rigid control of the Red Army can't keep up with events. The problem is that Hitler has come to see this sort of fluidity as an excuse to give up territory, and he's still very much trapped in his own First World War mindset of, well, we came under massive assault in Flanders, and we were constantly battered and shelled and bombed and outnumbered, but we didn't give up any ground, so why can't you do this? To do that on something the scale of the Eastern Front would require many, many times the number of men that are available, but he insists that this is how the battle is to be fought. So his fortress policy is almost an attempt to counter the arguments of his senior commanders of, we will declare these cities as fortresses. Their purpose is to act as breakwaters, if you like, that as the Red Army advances, these will hold fast. And even if the Soviets encircle them and move on past them, they will act as a drag anchor on the Soviet advance until the panzer divisions then arrive to restore the situation. And in order to prevent those pesky senior officers from abandoning these fortresses, he says, once the place is declared a fortress, it requires the Führer's permission for it to be abandoned. Fortress commandants are appointed, they're told to calculate what troops they need, and then those troops are never made available. And they're simply told, well, you can get them from units that are retreating past you. Even if that were possible, those are the very troops that you then require for the counterattack to restore the front line. So, this is again this problem of you're trying to squeeze a quart out of a pint pot. It's not a strategy that has any real credibility. And the bottom line is that the last time that, fortresses actually performed in the historical role of a fortress, you'd have to go back to the Napoleonic Wars, where during the retreat of 1813, Marshal Davout held out in Danzig until Napoleon surrendered. But even then, you could make a very strong case for saying, so what? It's not as if he tied down huge numbers of Prussian troops. After a while, the Prussians just left a couple of divisions to screen off the town and pushed on to the west. So the whole strategy doesn't really make any sense. The counter-argument is these fortresses were never intended to hold out for months and months and months. The idea was they will act as a local hindrance to a Soviet advance, and then a swift counterattack will restore the situation, without any awareness that there simply weren't the resources for that sort of swift counterattack. The other problem here is that what resources there are could conceivably do this, but they're very limited now. So you've got to guess with some accuracy where the hammer is going to fall so that you put your best mobile forces in that position in order to launch an early and decisive counterattack. And a big part of the story of Bagration is how the Soviets managed to mislead the Germans into moving so many panzer divisions away from the central sector.
Before we get to the deception, what's interesting is how much the Soviets have in place to ensure success. They sort of seem to go gangbusters on their build-up. It's a tremendous level of build-up, isn't it?
It's a huge level of build-up, and you have 4 fronts or army groups arrayed against the German army group center. So that's a third of the Soviet Union's frontline strength at this point. More guns per kilometer than ever before. And just as importantly, for the first time, they have stockpiled supplies in depth so that they will be able to sustain the initial surge in fighting for longer than before. They've also, probably for the first time, really recognized the importance of proper engineering support to establish bridges, to repair railways and roads, to recover wrecked armored vehicles. They have recognized something that the Germans have done from the very outset of the Second World War, which is understanding that you actually lose more armored vehicles to breakdown and being trapped by terrain than you do to enemy action. And recycling these damaged or stranded vehicles is a very, very efficient way of keeping your armored formations up to fighting strength. And the amount of engineering support for Soviet tank armies continues to rise throughout the Second World War, even after the success of Bagration. They look at it and think, yeah, it went pretty damn well, but we could have done better here. So as we move on to the Vistula Oder operation and then on to Berlin, the engineering support, it continues to be ramped up. So yes, you're right. The build-up is enormous. After the spring thaw, they have deliberately curtailed operations while they build up their resources in anticipation for this massive summer assault.
So you've got this enormous army slowly building up. How are the Soviets hiding the fact where the hammer's going to fall on the Germans?
There are several measures here, and it helps to understand how you gather intelligence on enemy operations. Obviously, reconnaissance is an important thing, and historically, the Germans have done very well with this. Unlike the Soviets, they have aircraft that have been designed from the outset as reconnaissance machines. They have very, very high quality camera equipment, and they have a lot of experience at analyzing aerial photographs, etc. They then look at signals intercepts. They look at the reports from interrogations of deserters and prisoners. And not so relevant by this phase of the war, but there's the old school of espionage where you would be spying deliberately to determine the enemy's intentions. That's less of a consideration now, particularly as the Germans have actually proved very, very bad at espionage throughout the war. So how do the Soviets counter all of those? Well, they've become much more skillful at hiding things. So they now tend to move units at night. In the battlefields that they're looking at in the central sector, there's a lot of forest in which they can hide things. So tank units, artillery units, infantry units move by night. They spend most of the day in the forests. They also start shuffling trains around so that when the Germans detect train movements, they pick up trains moving away from the central sector carrying troops rather than moving to it. And any trains moving to the central sector during daylight are empty, as if they're returning there to pick up more loads. They have entire divisions that spend the weeks before Bagration shuffling back and forth, pretending to be redeployed out of the central sector. So to an extent, they're fooling German aerial reconnaissance in a way they haven't done before. And they have much better fighter cover now. It's an interesting thing when you look at the Soviet use of fighter aircraft and indeed the modern Russian use of fighter aircraft. And I've spent quite a lot of time recently listening to the excellent Cold War Conversations podcast with interviews with pilots from both sides during the Cold War. And there is this common thread that much like their ground operations are much more top-down directed than we would be accustomed to in the West, or that the Germans were until Hitler started applying a heavy hand. The Soviets and the Russians have a greater tendency to have top-down directive operations. So when it comes to fighter operations, they don't tend to have British and US style, if you like, combat air patrols where fighters just roam across an area to achieve air superiority. Instead, a lot of their fighter operations are much more interception based. So they are under the control of ground controllers. The fighters will go out to intercept a German bomber force or whatever. And that doesn't really work well with reconnaissance aircraft that can just turn up at random. You really need fighters operating all the time. To a degree, by 1944, they're beginning to relax on this because they now have sufficient numbers of experienced pilots who know that actually the best way of operating is we'll just go up there and hang around and see what happens. So then they're mounting better fighter patrols over their areas to keep the reconnaissance planes off. They're also enforcing much, much tighter signals discipline. Orders are now passed routinely in document form rather than by radio signals or even by cable, because they're aware that the Germans have become very adept at sneaking across the front line and plugging themselves into the Soviet field telephone networks. So that reduces the amount of intelligence that the Germans are getting. There's always going to be a stream of deserters and prisoners who are going to be interrogated. So their solution to this is actually causes some difficulties. You just don't tell people what you're going to do. So even at sort of company and battalion level, people are informed very late in the day that we're actually about to launch a major offensive and you're going to be responsible for taking Vitebsk or Orsha or Bobruisk or whatever. So that actually contributes to the very heavy casualties that the Soviets suffer because of the lateness of some of the tactical preparations. But their calculation is, okay, that may cause some difficulties, but the benefit we get in not giving away our locations outweighs that. So the Germans are struggling with much less intelligence coming in. The Soviets are also deliberately misleading them, not least because unlike the Germans, the Soviets actually have very good espionage systems. They have a whole network of agents operating within Germany. They realize very rapidly that the Germans are expecting an operation in North Ukraine. For some of your listeners who may or may not be familiar with the geography, throughout history, the important region in the east has always been the Pripyat marshes, this enormous soggy area in the center of the Eastern Front, where basically you either invade east or west, traveling north of those marshes or south of those marshes. Pushing through those marshes themselves is a very, very tricky proposition. So the Germans have guessed as much as anything that the hammer will fall to the south of the Pripyat. And the Soviets are very, very happy to encourage them in this belief. So they make sure that all of those fake train loads of reinforcements are seen to be going towards Konyev's Ukrainian front rather than to the central region. And so they're very much playing on confirmation bias. And the Germans, say, well, we reckon they're going to attack in order to push through towards Lviv and points west. So they interpret all of the intelligence they gather to support their pre-existing belief. And although they're getting plenty of intelligence, and actually there's quite a major build-up against the center, their attitude is, well, they're building up everywhere, but the hammer will still fall to the south.
Had it worked to draw a lot off the center? Had it weakened it, or was there not that much to weaken, if you know what I mean?
Well, both. There wasn't much to start with, and it did weaken it dramatically. Army Group Center lost most of its tanks in the build-up to Bagration. Several panzer divisions, several independent panzer units, a lot of the assault gun brigades were moved out and sent to Army Group North Ukraine. German personalities also play a part here. So Army Group North Ukraine had been under Manstein's control until the spring when he fell out of favor, and Hitler's favorite Model was sent down there. He arrives just as the Soviet spring offensive is running out of steam and takes all the credit for stopping it. And the bottom line is they'd run out of fuel and ammunition and they were pretty exhausted. In fairness, he did a good job at the first Battle of Yassy, but the operation would have halted anyway. And Model is very adept at using his personal popularity with the Führer to get the lion's share of resources. So he's arguing very strongly for, the hammer's going to fall in my sector, so I need all of these panzer divisions. And in fact, a few more panzer divisions will be really handy. And because of his reputation and his high standing in Hitler's eyes, he gets those resources, and Army Group Center just gets weaker and weaker.
Now, I find intriguing is when they launch Bagration, it's a soft start to this sort of partisan activity, this probing attacks, and it's a number of days before the actual main assault. Is that part of a deception plan, or are the Russians learning something, or why not sort of this big shock and awe surprise and really knock them off their feet?
There are several aspects to that. So historically, this started in the First World War. During the Brusilov offensive, General Brusilov struggled to coordinate his armies to the point where he could do the big shock and awe thing. So he made a virtue out of necessity, and he realized that actually launching a staggered offensive was no bad thing, because as my good friend Dudley Giles said on a battlefield tour that we did in the Baltics, he said there are, only three certainties in life: death, taxes, and German counterattacks. So given that the Germans are going to counterattack, if you launch a staggered offensive, that actually works in your favor, because any local reserves will get sucked into counterattacks in the first sector to go hot, which means subsequent sectors might get an easier ride. So the Russians learned this almost by accident, and then it became a pattern of behavior thereafter, all the way through the Soviet era. The other aspects of this are that actually command and control of a massive shock and awe operation on that scale of 4 fronts is enormous. And it is actually, in many senses, easier to say, okay, we'll do this, maybe 1 or 2 fronts at a time, where we can concentrate the spotlight on this. And then once we're happy that's rolling well, we'll then unleash the next wave, And I guess the other point here is that the nature of a massive Soviet offensive is now a very complex affair. You have a step up of partisan activity. At roughly the same time, or maybe a day or so later, you have the extensive use of reconnaissance in force, which is to probe the German lines, identify weaknesses, seize good jumping off positions, try to force the German guns to open fire so that you can then use very effective counter-battery fire, etc. And then you hit them with the big stick. So even when you decide, all right, this is where we're really going to attack, it takes time for all of these steps to proceed.
They're vastly outnumbered. We have these sort of repeated punches. It's always like hit them in the face, hit them in the body. How successful is that opening phase for the Soviets?
Generally, it's actually very successful. The Red Army has now learned the hard way that the German front line is actually quite brittle. And this goes to the losses suffered in late 1941. And we're not talking actually of human losses, we're talking of equine losses. German infantry is still very, very dependent upon horse-drawn transport. Even in 1944, an infantry division has several thousand horses on its complement to pull much of its heavy equipment. Even on those occasions where a lot of this has been officially redesignated as motorized traction, there simply isn't the fuel available. There aren't the trucks available. So there is a saying in the Red Army by this stage that the first 3 kilometers are the hard bit. If we can push the Germans out of their positions, they're forced to abandon their heavy guns. Because they no longer have the mobility to tow their guns back into new positions and then fight again. So if we can lever them out of the front line, we actually stand a cracking good chance of breaking through into open ground. They're aware that the Germans have, even in the central sector where they're expecting some attacks, but not the big attack. Even here, they're aware that in some places the Germans have built defenses in depth, and there are sort of second and third belts of defenses, each belt consisting of 3 specific trench lines, in some cases only 2. So they're very aware of, if we can overwhelm the first line and break through it and stop them extracting a lot of their heavy weapons, the second and third belts will be relatively straightforward to overrun. They go into the attack with the full awareness they're going to take very heavy losses breaking through this front line. But once they've done that, they then have all of their exploitation forces, their tank armies, their cavalry mechanized groups, etc., waiting to be deployed in order to drive the Germans back so fast that they can't make a meaningful stand at their second and third belts. And in previous operations, when the Red Army has attacked, it's often been forced to use some of these exploitation forces in order to achieve the initial breakthrough, which means that the exploitation forces are then weakened when it comes to their proper role. But during Bagration, almost everywhere, the actual breakthrough forces succeed in doing what they're meant to do.
How quickly do the Germans realise they're in trouble?
It depends who you're talking to. Down in the southern part of Army Group Centre, General Jordan has been saying from the very outset, I'm about to come under massive attack. I don't care what's happening in North Ukraine. This is where it's at. And he's been ignored. So when the attacks start unfolding, he's still saying, I refer you to the memo I sent you a few days ago. Well, guess what? It's now happening, and I need reinforcements. So he knows from the very outset that this is really, really bad. But there are others who continue to have a level of complacency which is almost inconceivable. In the north, the so-called Third Panzer Army, which doesn't have a single panzer formation to its name at this stage, is defending around Vitebsk. And Reinhardt remains astonishingly complacent, even after Vitebsk is almost encircled and his forces either side of the city have been really battered into mere remnants of their original strength. He's still saying, well, I reckon I can probably bring this attack to a halt fairly soon. And has no real comprehension that so far he's only been facing the breakthrough forces. The exploitation forces are yet to come. Part of this may well be the success of Soviet deception and camouflage. A lot of it is down to the ongoing German confirmation bias that these are deception attacks to lure attention away from North Ukraine. Some of it is just straightforward German arrogance. You know, we've stopped them before, we'll stop them again. Okay, we're going to lose a bit of ground. The Fuhrer's going to be cross because we retreated. Big deal. You know, the Soviet Union's a big place. We can afford to do this. So the reaction is mixed, and it's not helped by the fact that the commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Busch, in the long, long history of human affairs in which people end up being over-promoted beyond their level of expertise, Busch would be an Olympic medal contender for that. He's way out of his depth commanding an army group, and in particular commanding an army group in 1944, where if you're going to be at all successful, you're going to have to show a degree of initiative and insubordination to deal with the top-down diktat that is paralyzing the German military and depriving it of its one real chance of prevailing, which is to fight a fluid battle where its tactical skills outmatch those of its opponents. And Busch is just not the right man, and he continues to say, well, the Fuhrer says we have to hold, full stop. And for him, this is now just an article of faith. And, you know, I think at one point he even says, I'm a good sergeant major. Well, you're not. You're a field marshal. You know, you should be showing much more initiative. He doesn't support his army commanders. He simply acts as a one-way signal box. He doesn't really pass on their concerns from Jordan's Ninth Army in the south. He just doesn't do it. And because he knows that's not what the Fuhrer wants to hear. So he adds to the paralysis of Army Group Center in those critical days where the Germans could conceivably have, well, they might have been able to restore the situation if they'd acted with greater alacrity. But even then, frankly, at this point, like I say, they're only up against the first wave. The second echelon of Soviet forces are just at this point, you know, revving up their engines and getting themselves forward. The real nightmare has yet to begin.
Well, so from Busch's point of view, how much is Berlin interfering with his battle, as it were? Because Berlin must also be trying to deal with the West, which they're tinkering with as well. So there's a lot happening, particularly potentially remotely.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge amount of tinkering going on. And this is part of the problem, that the Führer briefings now drag on and on and on because he insists on knowing what's happening down to regimental level, which, even if he was just looking at the Western Front, that would be a massively time-consuming business. But then you add the vastness of the Eastern Front and how many divisions are deployed there, and he wants to know where every regiment is and what it's doing. So you then have one panzer division that's sent down to try to restore the situation in the southern half of Army Group Centre. And poor Jordan, who is the one man who has warned of the impending catastrophe, finds that although this division has been assigned to him, he's being told exactly how to use it. And it's to be broken up into different battle groups, one to be sent here, another to be sent there. And then when none of those battle groups prevail because individually they're too weak, guess who gets the blame? It's Jordan. How dare you misuse this panzer division so badly? And it doesn't matter that Jordan can say with every justification, I did exactly as Army Group headquarters had told me. And indeed, Army Group headquarters can say, well, we did what the Führer told us. That's not going to work. So Jordan very rapidly gets sacked purely by committing the cardinal error of being right in everything that he had said.
So Bush is replaced. Hitler replaces him within a month? He's gone?
Yeah, he goes within a very short time, and Model is appointed as commander. But Model is at the same time commander of Army Group North Ukraine. So he's now commanding two army groups. And this is seen as a virtue because it means that he already knows what panzer divisions he has in Army Group North Ukraine, and he can move those up now to deal with what's happening in Army Group Centre. But it takes time. It takes, I think it's something absurd, like 20 locomotive trains to move a panzer division. And, you then have to stockpile fuel and ammunition. And these divisions arrive in dribs and drabs. And because of the urgency of the situation, these individual battle groups are thrown into action almost as they arrive, rather than allowing the panzer divisions to concentrate and be used as, a single entity. When you compare and contrast with, the use of panzer divisions outside Stalingrad, where Hermann Balk's 11th Panzer Division fought a phenomenal defensive battle along the Chir River, or 6th Panzer Division in the attempt to relieve the encirclement, or indeed the SS Panzer Divisions around Kharkiv. We don't really see that anymore. Now we just see individual battle groups. It's very, very rare that a Panzer Division commander gets to wield his whole division as a single weapon, as it's intended to be used. And, however good they are, they're just being swamped by this enormous tide that's flowing in the opposite direction.
Model was one of Hitler's favourites. Is he allowed more freedom of action? Is he allowed to order the withdrawal from fortress cities?
Yeah, this is one of the benefits of being Hitler's favorite, that you can get away with a lot more stuff than other people could. But even then, he has to compromise. He has to act according to orders from above. There are other complications here too. So when the Wehrmacht advanced across this entire region, gradually, the army handed over control to the rear area authorities, who then in turn handed over to the civil authorities. As the Germans have retreated, both of the rear area authorities and the civil authorities have proved singularly reluctant to let go of their territories and their control. So the rear area is this absolute mishmash of occupation units, police units, SS, anti-partisan units, civilian authorities, construction battalions, labor gang, you name it, they're all there. They attempt to corral these into impromptu battle groups, many of which evaporate as rapidly as they're formed. An SS battle group is formed and assigned to Dietrich von Sauken, who takes command of, first of all, 5th Panzer Division as it arrives, and then this is all renamed 39th Panzer Corps, which has been destroyed further east in the meantime. He's given von Kottberg's SS as a subordinated unit. And they're useless. These guys may be very adept at massacring Belarusian civilians in the name of anti-partisan operations, but when it comes to fighting the Red Army, that's a very different matter. And they either evaporate or they get overwhelmed very, very quickly. And then Kottberg just announces that his unit is too weak to carry on the battle and unilaterally pulls it out of the front line and heads west. Just absolutely staggering that, this level of lack of coordination and control could be tolerated. So Model has his hands full. He's trying to rescue isolated, broken up units. He's aware that the original strength of Army Group Center is dissipating by the day. At the same time, he's trying to channel reinforcements into the area. But he's also like so many of the German commanders. Many of them, ever since the early days of 1942, have tended to operate to an extent in a vacuum, in that Hitler has now got to a stage in early 42 where he deliberately denies them knowledge of what's happening on either flank. And this arises from an incident in early 42 where a Panzer Division liaison officer was shot down and all the plans for the advance on Stalingrad were captured by the Soviets and subsequently ignored. But that's another story. In order to avoid that sort of intelligence leak in future, Hitler imposes this vertical siloing. So people like Model, who probably know how to circumvent that. After all, they'll have personal contacts in other army groups, etc., especially someone like Model, who has been rushed from one sector to another. So he'll have a good awareness of what's happening elsewhere, but he makes a virtue out of this compartmentalization by insisting that, well, mein Führer, I can only hold on if you send me X number of divisions as reinforcements, when he should know full well that that number of divisions just doesn't exist anymore.
Loyal listener, we're going to pause there. We'll be back in a moment. How much of a problem is success for the Russians? I was sort of thinking back to those. There's a quote, and I meant to look it up about the German army bleeding themselves to success or something in 1941 as they pressed into Russia. They're basically winning themselves to defeat. Well, I can't remember the quote anyway. Is it similar for the Russians as they head in the opposite direction?
Well, they're benefited by geography. So as the Germans advanced in 1941, they started from a front line that ran across eastern Poland and up around East Prussia, and then down through the Balkans. As they advanced east, that front line doubled in width. With Army Group North heading off towards Leningrad, Army Group Center heading off more or less east towards Moscow, and Army Group South heading off southeast. By contrast, as the Soviets advance, their front line is shortening because the same geography applies, only in reverse. They're also advancing into an area where gradually the road and rail networks improve. So you're moving away from the barren areas of central Russia into areas where there are better communications, though the Germans are doing their best to wreck those as they pull out. So those disadvantages that the Germans experienced are diluted, at least for the Red Army. Their main problem is that it's simply moving the amount of supplies forward needed to keep an offensive on this scale going. And this is where this offensive really distinguishes itself from its predecessors, that they largely succeed in keeping sufficient supplies going forward in order to maintain enough mobility to overwhelm the increasingly weak resistance that they're facing. Had the Germans ever been able to catch their breath, they would probably have been able to strengthen their positions faster than the Soviets could bring forward supplies. But the Soviets keep them rolling backwards again and again. And it's only finally when the Germans reach the Vistula and the eastern borders of East Prussia that, if you like, the contest between the ability of Germany to reinforce its front line and the ability of the Soviet Union to keep its forward momentum, it's only at that stage that it tilts in favor of the Germans. Until then, the Red Army is just on top all the way.
Interesting point as you're pushing into sort of Poland and the Baltic states. I wonder how that is viewed by the local population. Are they Are the Russians now occupiers or liberators? Is that a problem? Because,
Well,
yeah,
it's a huge problem. It really is a huge problem because, and again, there are nuances to this that are very important. When you look at the Baltic states, generally, most of the anti-German partisan activity there is not necessarily pro-Soviet. These are, if you like, Baltic nationalists who don't really like either side. There are increasing numbers of pro-Soviet partisans, not least because they're being infiltrated into the area. In the case of Lithuania, you also have significant numbers of Jewish partisans, some of whom are anti-Soviet, others are quite pro-Soviet, some are Zionist, others aren't. And the interrelationship between these different groups is very complex. And in the case of Lithuania, you also have a big problem in that a big chunk of eastern Lithuania was Poland until 1939. So probably the strongest force in this area is the Polish Home Army, the AK, who are not only anti-Soviet, they also tend to be quite, in that region at least, a lot of them tend to be quite strongly anti-Semitic. And, this adds to a very, very complex situation. When you get into Belarus, most of the partisans are pro-Soviet, but as you move west into the areas that had been occupied by Poland before 1939, you encounter increasing numbers of AK fighters who are hostile to the Soviets. The cooperation between the Soviet Union and the Polish government in exile has been difficult, shall we say, ever since the discovery of the mass graves at Katyn, which the Poles quite rightly blame on the Soviets. The Soviets blame on the Germans. The British and Americans have very sound intelligence that actually these were massacres carried out by the Soviets, but for political reasons and keeping Stalin on side, they accept the fiction that these massacres were carried out by the Germans, which the Poles are very unhappy about. But the hostility of the Poles towards the Soviet Union means that as the Red Army advances into former Polish areas, as the AK attempts to carry out uprisings to seize control of major cities, the Soviets are generally quite happy to let the Poles and Germans fight each other, and then they will move in and swiftly disarm the AK, arrest their officers, etc., and give their fighters a choice of you can either join the Red Army or you can go to Siberia. It's your choice. Having said that, I think it's fair to say that Stalin had anticipated the scale of difficulty of dealing with potentially anti-Soviet groups as he enters Poland and the Baltic states. So the NKVD is well prepared for this. Their operation to disarm potentially anti-Soviet groups moves into action very, very swiftly as the Red Army advances.
You think that was what happens at Warsaw? Because they get that ultimately they're into the outskirts at Warsaw when the Home Army, Polish Home Army, rises up, and there is tens of thousands of them, but the Russians just pause. Are they just letting the nature take its toll, as it were?
Yeah, so the official argument here, or the official line always was, well, we've just advanced all the way across Belarus. We've taken very heavy losses. We're moving across a devastated landscape. Railways are still wrecked. Bridges are down. There's a limit to how fast we can move forward supplies. There has to be an operational pause. It's unfortunate that this happens to be on the Vistula while the AK is fighting and dying in Warsaw. And that is the official line. And there is a problem in the West. There is a division of opinion. Roosevelt is inclined to accept Stalin's excuses because he's already got his eyes on the forthcoming Yalta conference, where they're going to be agreeing plans for the post-war order. And he is very anxious to ensure Stalin's cooperation with his plan for the United Nations, etc. To a very large extent, he's content, not necessarily happy, but he's content to throw Eastern Europe to Stalin as the price for getting Stalin's cooperation. Churchill's role in all of this is inevitably every bit as complex as you would expect with anything involving Churchill. On the one hand, Many Poles would say, and I would say with great justification, that Churchill betrayed Britain's first ally to a very large extent, in that at Tehran he had effectively agreed to the Soviet Union keeping the Polish territories it had seized in 1939 without any consultation with Poland. And this is Churchill behaving very much like a 19th century statesman, where the great powers decide and the little powers can just shut up and do as they're told. On the other hand, perhaps partly because of a sense of guilt about this, Churchill is the most vociferous of the Western allies in calling out Stalin over his failure to do anything to support the Warsaw Uprising. It's worth pointing out that throughout the Warsaw Uprising, German aircraft are able to operate against the AK in Warsaw almost with impunity. And the Soviets have massive aerial assets available. It would have been a very, very simple matter for them to enforce air superiority over Warsaw, which would have had a huge effect on the ability of the AK to resist. Very little attempt was made. It would have been a relatively straightforward matter to drop supplies. And although some Polikarpov biplanes were used, the tonnage of supplies delivered was very, very small. In September, the Red Army reaches the banks of the Vistula opposite the central part of Warsaw. So they're now barely 200 meters from the AK. Eventually, one Polish division attempts to make crossings. It makes crossings and is then forced to evacuate. It suffers 5,000 casualties in the process over about less than a week. But it's worth bearing in mind that is only one of 3 divisions of the First Polish Army. And the First Polish Army is only one of several armies available to Rokossowski. So they could easily have sent more forces over. And even if they weren't going to send more forces over, they could have lined up sufficient tanks and assault guns and field artillery on their shore of the Vistula to make it impossible for the Germans to operate on the other bank. And that would have then allowed them to set up cable ferries across the river to send supplies to the AK, etc. But, from Stalin's point of view, Poles and Germans killing each other is a cracking good thing, because it means that any future government in Warsaw is not going to be the government in exile. It's going to be his puppet government that he's set up in Lublin.
So when we look at Bagration, how did the losses in human and material compare with other major battles up to this period of the war?
Well, this is a really interesting thing, because this, of course, all unfolds in parallel with the Battle of Normandy and the fighting in northern France. And there's a very interesting statistic here that in the West, for every soldier that the Western Allies lost, the Germans lost 2.2 men. And as a consequence of that, their Western armies went down to a catastrophic defeat. During Bagration, for every soldier the Germans lost, the Red Army lost 2.2 men. And yet the Germans still go down to a catastrophic defeat. So it's a really interesting example of how sometimes it's not the ratio of losses that matters. It's the ability of your own side to sustain the losses it suffered. To an extent, we can see that unfolding in Ukraine at the moment, where the Russians are losing many, many times as many troops as the Ukrainians, but Ukraine is actually running out of resources probably faster than the Russians are, not least because of questionable support from parts of the West over this. But it makes a good point that it's your ability to sustain those losses that matters. And by now, Germany's ability to sustain these losses is almost non-existent. By the end of the summer of 1944, the Eastern Front is now once more a continuous line. If you look at the maps, there's a whole series of divisions. Many of those divisions, though, are of highly questionable fighting power. Many of them are these new Volksgrenadier divisions that are being created by the Germans. which have fewer battalions than the old infantry divisions, and yet they're expected to hold the same length of front line. This constant creation of new divisions also results in units that are relatively inexperienced. If those same reinforcements had been sent to fill out the ranks of the depleted divisions, that might have been a more effective use of Germany's diminishing manpower. But concentrating them into new divisions means you have units that have to learn the hard lessons of fighting, all over again, whilst the veterans are dying simply because their units are so badly degraded. And this leads to when Guderian becomes Chief of General Staff and visits the Eastern Front in the winter that follows and reports back to Hitler, Hitler tells him, the Eastern Front has rarely been stronger, and I thank you for this. And Guderian's response is, the Eastern Front is a house of cards that will collapse at the first blow. And Hitler just shrugs and says, well, it's going to have to make do with what it's got, because that's all there is.
I was going to finish with, so how does this set the Russians up for the next stage of the war? Because they've essentially run out of steam now, so there's a pause, isn't there, in the Eastern Front?
Yeah, there has to be a pause in order to bring forward reinforcements and ammunition. No army in the world could sustain that level of offensive without an operational pause. In a way, the same thing has happened to the Western Allies as they break into the Low Countries. There comes a stage where, until you have Antwerp open and until those supplies are running from there in a reliable fashion to the front line, you're going to have to pause for breath. And the Soviets are in the same position. But importantly, they have seized a couple of bridgeheads over the Vistula River, which will improve their ability to renew offensive operations. Inevitably, the Sandomir and Magnushev bridgeheads are going to be key to the breakout across Poland. But you've come roughly halfway from the summer start line to Berlin. This is an enormous advance. You've also destroyed over 20 German divisions completely, and although they've rebuilt their front line, the new divisions are a shadow of the strength of their predecessors. And the Soviets now know this is purely a matter of time and blood before it's all over. But there is still an awful lot of blood to be spilled before it is over.
Indeed, I look forward to having you back to look at the closing months of the war on the Eastern Front. Loyal listener, Prit's book is Bagration, 1944, The Great Soviet Offensive, and it is available now from all good booksellers. I will, of course, put a link in the show notes and on the website. Now, if you have enjoyed this podcast, don't forget you can support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. As a patron, you'll get access to ad-free episodes, so you can enjoy every discussion without interruptions. Plus, you'll occasionally receive exclusive bonus content that didn't make it into the show. So to sign up, head over to patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that is it for this episode. I don't know what we'll be looking at next, so it'll be a surprise to us all. But until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.